I never thought I'd be sitting in my own kitchen, staring at a plate of my mother-in-law's famous lasagna, knowing it could kill me. My name is Sarah, and for 3 years, I've been slowly poisoned by the woman who raised the man I love. The irony isn't lost on me that Linda Thompson, a retired nurse who spent 30 years caring for patients, has been systematically destroying my health one home-cooked meal at a time. What she doesn't know is that I've been documenting everything. And tonight, at the annual Thompson family reunion, she's going to get a taste of her own medicine. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The October wind rattles the windows of our little house on Maple Street as I sit in the kitchen where this nightmare began. 3 years ago, I was a healthy 30-year-old newlywed who had just moved from Portland to Riverside, Ohio, to start a new life with Mike Thompson. I thought I was the luckiest woman alive. Mike was everything I'd dreamed of in a husband: kind, funny, hardworking, and completely devoted to his family. That devotion, I would learn, came with a price I never could have imagined. The Thompson family seemed like something out of a Norman Rockwell painting when I first met them. Linda and Bob had been married for 35 years, living in the same sprawling house on Oak Avenue where Mike and his sister Jenny had grown up. Sunday dinners were sacred. Holiday celebrations were elaborate affairs, and Linda Thompson was the undisputed queen of the kitchen. She had this way of making everyone feel welcome, of knowing exactly what dish would comfort you after a hard day, of remembering your favorite dessert from a conversation you'd had months earlier. I remember the first time she cooked for me, just 2 weeks after Mike and I got engaged. It was a simple Wednesday evening dinner, nothing fancy, but Linda had prepared my favorite chicken parmesan after hearing me mention it once in passing. She watched with such satisfaction as I took that first bite, her gray eyes twinkling with what I mistook for grandmother warmth. "Sarah, honey," she said in that soft voice that carried just a hint of her Kentucky childhood, "you're going to fit right into this family. I can already tell how wrong I was." The symptoms started gradually, so subtly that I dismissed them as stress from the wedding planning. Then from adjusting to a new job at Morrison Marketing Group, then from the general overwhelm of transplanting my entire life to the Midwest. It began with occasional stomach upset after family dinners, which I attributed to Linda's rich cooking. Coming from the Pacific Northwest where I'd lived on salads and quinoa bowls, the heavy casseroles and cream-based sauces of Ohio comfort food were a shock to my system. Mike would rub my back as I lay in bed with cramps, bringing me ginger tea and aspirin. "Mom's cooking takes some getting used to," he'd say with a fond smile. "She shows love through food, always has. You should see what she used to pack in my school lunches." The other kids were so jealous. He'd tell stories about Linda staying up all night, making homemade bread for bake sales, spending entire weekends preparing elaborate birthday cakes, teaching Jenny and him to cook by having them stand on chairs at the kitchen counter, measuring flour into mixing bowls. The Thompson family mythology painted Linda as the perfect mother, the selfless caregiver who had sacrificed her own ambitions to raise 2 successful children. She'd worked as a nurse at Riverside General for 3 decades, earning respect throughout the community for her competence and compassion. Patients requested her specifically, doctors trusted her judgment, and younger nurses looked up to her as a mentor. When she retired 5 years ago, the hospital threw her a celebration attended by half the town. But as the months passed and the symptoms persisted, I began to notice patterns that didn't quite fit the narrative. The stomach problems only occurred after eating Linda's food, never after meals I prepared myself or restaurant dinners. The intensity seemed to correlate with how much Linda had been involved in the cooking process. Most tellingly, Mike never got sick, even when we ate identical meals. At first, I thought it might be an allergy or sensitivity I'd developed. I started keeping a food diary, noting what I ate and how I felt afterward. The correlation was undeniable, but when I mentioned it to Mike, he looked at me like I'd suggested his mother was a serial killer. "Sarah, that's impossible," he said, his voice carrying the patient tone people use with children who claim monsters live under their beds. "Mom has fed this family for decades. She's a nurse, for crying out loud. She knows more about nutrition and food safety than anyone." He pulled me close, kissing my forehead. "Maybe you should see Dr. Williams about food allergies. Could be something you developed as an adult. Dr. Patricia Williams had been the Thompson family physician for 20 years, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s with salt and pepper hair, and the direct manner of someone who'd delivered bad news more times than she cared to count. She conducted a thorough examination and ordered a battery of tests. Everything came back normal. No allergies, no sensitivities, no underlying conditions that would explain my symptoms. Stress can manifest in physical ways, she told me during my follow-up appointment, her fingers tapping thoughtfully against her clipboard. You've had a lot of changes recently. New marriage, new city, new job. Your body might be responding to the adjustment period. I'd recommend reducing stress where possible, maybe trying some relaxation techniques. I left her office feeling dismissed and slightly crazy. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe the stress of trying to fit into Mike's close-knit family was making me paranoid. Linda certainly didn't act like someone harboring malicious intent. She continued to welcome me warmly, always asking about my work, remembering details about my life, including me, in family traditions and holiday preparations. But the symptoms didn't just continue, they escalated. What started as occasional stomach upset evolved into more serious problems. I began experiencing dizziness, fatigue that no amount of sleep could cure, and episodes of confusion that left me struggling to complete simple tasks at work. There were mornings when I'd wake up feeling like I was viewing the world through a thick fog, my thoughts sluggish and disconnected. The breaking point came during Thanksgiving of my second year in Riverside. Linda had outdone herself with the feast, spending 3 days preparing dishes that showcased her culinary expertise. The dining room table groaned under the weight of turkey with sage stuffing, green bean casserole with crispy onions, sweet potato souffle topped with toasted marshmallows, and her famous cranberry walnut bread that had won the county fair blue ribbon 5 years running. I tried to eat sparingly, taking small portions and focusing on items that hadn't spent much time in Linda's hands. But she noticed my restraint and kept piling food onto my plate with the insistence of a loving grandmother. "Sarah, honey, you're getting too thin," she chided, spooning an extra helping of stuffing next to my turkey. "We need to put some meat on your bones. Mike, tell your wife she needs to eat more." Mike laughed, completely oblivious to my discomfort. "Mom's right, babe. You've been working too hard lately. You need comfort food." He reached over to squeeze my hand, his touch warm and reassuring, completely unaware that his mother's comfort food was slowly destroying me. I managed to choke down about half of what was on my plate before excusing myself to the bathroom. The familiar nausea was building, accompanied by a strange metallic taste in my mouth that I'd begun to associate with Linda's cooking. I splashed cold water on my face and stared at my reflection in the ornate mirror that had hung in the Thompson family bathroom for decades. The woman looking back at me bore little resemblance to the vibrant person who had moved to Ohio 2 years earlier. My skin had taken on a grayish pallor, my eyes looked sunken, and I'd lost nearly 15 pounds despite Linda's constant efforts to feed me. Dark circles shadowed my eyes, and my hair had lost its shine, hanging limp around my face like seaweed. When I returned to the dining room, the family was deep in conversation about Jenny's new teaching position at Riverside Elementary. Carlos was telling a story about a recent fire call, gesturing animatedly while Bob nodded with the approval of a man who understood dangerous work. Linda sat at the head of the table like a benevolent queen, occasionally interjecting with questions or comments that kept the conversation flowing smoothly. She looked up as I slid back into my chair, her gray eyes scanning my face with what appeared to be concern. "Sarah, sweetheart, you look a little pale. Are you feeling all right?" The question was delivered with perfect maternal solicitude, but something in her expression made my skin crawl. For just a moment, I could have sworn I saw satisfaction lurking behind the word. "I'm fine," I managed, forcing a smile. "Just tired from the long week. Maybe you should take some vitamins," she suggested, already rising from her chair. "I have some excellent supplements in the kitchen." Natural remedies are always better than those synthetic things they sell at the drugstore. She bustled away before I could protest, returning moments later with a small glass of water and what looked like a handful of capsules. "Linda, I really don't need," I started, but Mike cut me off. "Take them, Sarah. Mom knows what she's talking about," She practically ran the hospital pharmacy for years. His tone carried a hint of irritation that I was being difficult about his mother's generosity. I stared at the pills in Linda's outstretched palm, my stomach churning with more than just nausea. Everything in me screamed not to take them, but I was surrounded by Mike's family, all watching with expectant faces. To refuse would be to openly accuse Linda of trying to harm me, something I couldn't do without proof. So I swallowed the capsules, chasing them down with water while Linda watched with that same satisfied expression I was beginning to recognize. Within an hour I was violently ill, spending the rest of Thanksgiving evening in the bathroom, while Mike held my hair back and Linda offered helpful suggestions about food poisoning remedies. "Poor thing," she murmured, pressing a cool washcloth to my forehead. "You must have gotten into something that didn't agree with you. These stomach bugs can be so unpredictable." Her touch was gentle, her voice full of sympathy, but I felt like a mouse being comforted by a cat. That night, lying in bed with Mike's arms around me as he slept peacefully beside me, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to find out what Linda Thompson was doing to me, and I was going to stop her. The woman who had spent 30 years as a nurse, who commanded respect throughout Riverside, who had raised the man I loved, was slowly poisoning me, and somehow I was going to prove it. The next morning, I called my best friend Rachel Chen, who owned the independent pharmacy downtown where I'd been getting my prescriptions filled since moving to Riverside. Rachel and I had bonded over being transplants to small-town Ohio. She'd moved from San Francisco after pharmacy school to take over her uncle's business. We shared the experience of being outsiders trying to find our place in a community where everyone's roots ran 3 generations deep. "Rachel," I said when she answered the phone, my voice barely above a whisper even though Mike had already left for work. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to promise you won't think I'm crazy." "Sarah, what's wrong? You sound terrible." I took a deep breath and told her everything. The symptoms, the patterns, the way Linda's concern always felt performative rather than genuine. Rachel listened without interruption, and when I finished, the silence stretched between us for what felt like an eternity. "Sarah," she said finally, her voice careful and measured, "what you're describing sounds like chronic low-level poisoning, but to prove something like that, we'd need evidence, real evidence, not just patterns and suspicions." "What kind of evidence?" "Hair samples, blood tests, residue analysis of food, and even then, proving intentional poisoning versus accidental contamination would be nearly impossible without catching someone in the act." She paused, and I could hear her thinking, but there might be another way. If someone was systematically poisoning you, they'd need a consistent method, access to substances, knowledge of dosages, a way to administer them without detection. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Linda's a retired nurse," I said quietly. "She has access to medical supplies. She knows about medications and their effects, and she cooks for me at least 3 times a week. Then we need to be smart about this, document everything, keep samples of food when possible. And Sarah," Rachel's voice dropped to a whisper, "be very, very careful. If you're right about this, you're dealing with someone who's been planning this for a long time." Over the following weeks, I became a detective in my own life. I started declining Linda's invitations for solo visits, claiming work deadlines or prior commitment. When family dinners were unavoidable, I developed strategies, arriving with a stomachache that prevented me from eating much, volunteering to help in the kitchen so I could observe Linda's food preparation, even secretly switching plates with Mike when possible. The more I watched, the more convinced I became that my suspicions were correct. Linda had subtle ways of ensuring I got specific portions, often preparing a separate plate, just for Sarah, or adding extra seasonings to my food under the guise of catering to my taste. She remembered details about my preferences with uncanny accuracy, always knowing exactly which dishes to push on me, but it was the way she watched me eat that finally convinced me beyond doubt. While everyone else at the table focused on conversation and their own meals, Linda's attention kept drifting to me. She'd note when I took bites, observe my reactions, and adjust her behavior accordingly. If I seemed to be avoiding a particular dish, she'd find reasons to serve me more of it. If I appeared to be feeling unwell, she'd express concern while simultaneously offering remedies that invariably made me feel worse. The breakthrough came in January, during a family celebration for Bob's 60th birthday. Linda had spent days preparing his favorite meal, pot roast, with vegetables, mashed potatoes, and her signature chocolate cake. I arrived early to help with preparations, hoping to observe her cooking process more closely. She was in her element, moving around the kitchen with the confidence of someone who had commanded operating rooms and emergency situations. Every movement was precise, every ingredient measured to perfection. I offered to help, but she waved me away with a smile. "Nonsense, Sarah, you're a guest. Besides, I have my own system. Too many cooks spoil the broth, as they say." She gestured toward the living room where I could hear Mike and Bob discussing football. "Go relax with the men, I'll call you when dinner's ready." But I lingered in the doorway pretending to be engaged in the conversation while keeping one eye on Linda's movements. I watched her prepare individual plates, noting how she added extra gravy to mine, how she selected the largest piece of roast for my portion, and then I saw something that made my blood run cold. From a small container tucked behind the flour canister, Linda removed what looked like a salt shaker. She glanced around quickly to ensure she wasn't being observed, then sprinkled a small amount of whatever was inside over my food. The motion was so practiced, so automatic, that I knew she'd done it countless times before. When she turned to carry the plates to the dining room, I slipped into the kitchen and photographed the container with my phone. The label had been removed, but I could see traces of adhesive where it had been. I managed to carefully transfer a small amount of the contents into a tissue, which I tucked into my purse before joining the family for dinner. That night, I gave the sample to Rachel, who promised to have it analyzed by a contact at the regional lab. The results came back 3 days later. The powder contained a mixture of medications that, when combined and administered regularly in small doses, would cause exactly the symptoms I'd been experiencing. It was a sophisticated cocktail that demonstrated extensive knowledge of pharmacology and human physiology. "Sarah," Rachel said when she called with the results, her voice shaking slightly, "this isn't just poisoning, this is attempted murder. Slow, deliberate, and calculated. Whoever did this wanted you to suffer, and they wanted it to look natural." I spent that evening researching the medications Linda had been feeding me, learning about their effects and potential interactions. The more I read, the more horrified I became. The combination was designed to gradually damage my organs while creating symptoms that could be attributed to stress, allergies, or other common conditions. Left unchecked, it would eventually kill me, and Linda's medical background would make her the perfect person to provide comfort and support to my grieving husband. But knowing what she was doing and proving it were two different things. I needed more than a sample of contaminated seasoning. I needed to catch her in the act, preferably with witnesses, and I needed to understand her motivation. Why did Linda Thompson, respected nurse and beloved mother, want me dead? The answer came to me gradually as I began paying closer attention to family dynamics. Linda's relationship with Mike wasn't just close, it was possessive. She had been the center of his world for 34 years, the woman who kissed his scraped knees, celebrated his achievements, and provided unconditional love and support. My marriage to her son hadn't just added a new family member, it had displaced her from her position as the most important woman in Mike's life. I started noticing how Linda's mood shifted whenever Mike showed me affection, how she found ways to interrupt our conversations, how she consistently steered family discussions toward topics that excluded me. She had welcomed me into the family not because she was happy about my marriage to Mike, but because she was planning to ensure it wouldn't last long. As winter turned to spring, I continued gathering evidence while pretending nothing had changed. I documented every family dinner, photographed Linda's food preparation when possible, and kept detailed records of my symptoms. Rachel helped me analyze additional samples, each one confirming the presence of the same toxic mixture. But I also began developing my own plan. If Linda wanted to play the role of the caring mother-in-law while slowly murdering me, I would give her a taste of her own medicine. Literally. The opportunity came in early May, when Linda announced that she wanted to host a special dinner to celebrate Mike's promotion at the accounting firm. "It's been too long since we had a proper family gathering," she said during our weekly phone call, her voice warm with false affection. "I'll make all of Mike's favorites, and of course, I have some special dishes planned just for you, Sarah." The emphasis she placed on special sent chills down my spine, but I forced myself to sound enthusiastic. "That sounds wonderful, Linda. Is there anything I can bring?" "Just yourself, sweetheart. I want to pamper you both. You've been looking so tired lately, and I have some new vitamins I want you to try. All natural, excellent for energy and overall health." I hung up the phone with my hands shaking. Linda wasn't just planning to continue poisoning me, she was escalating. The special dinner and new vitamins suggested she was preparing to administer a larger dose, possibly enough to cause serious damage, or even death. That's when I decided it was time for Linda Thompson to get exactly what she'd been giving me. The plan began forming in my mind as I sat in Rachel's pharmacy after hours, surrounded by medical journals and toxicology reports. She had stayed late to help me research the exact compounds Linda had been using, and what we discovered was both terrifying and enlightening. Linda hadn't just been randomly poisoning me, she had crafted a precise pharmaceutical cocktail that would cause maximum suffering, while remaining virtually undetectable through standard medical testing. "Look at this combination," Rachel said, pointing to her computer screen where she had mapped out the drug interactions. "She's using medications that are common enough individually that any doctor would dismiss them as coincidental if they showed up in blood work. But together they create a synergistic effect that amplifies the toxicity exponentially." I studied the chart Rachel had created, noting how each component served a specific purpose in Linda's twisted plan. The first medication caused gastrointestinal distress and malabsorption, ensuring that my body couldn't properly process nutrients. The second affected my nervous system, causing the dizziness and confusion that had been plaguing me. The third worked on my cardiovascular system, creating fatigue and weakness. Combined, they were slowly destroying my health from multiple angles simultaneously. "She knows exactly what she's doing," I murmured, feeling a chill run down my spine. "This isn't just poisoning, it's torture." Rachel nodded grimly, and the beauty of it, from her perspective, is that each symptom could be explained away by stress, poor diet, or other lifestyle factors. "She's been banking on the fact that no one would suspect a respected nurse of systematically poisoning her daughter-in-law." We spent the next 2 hours researching antidotes and recovery protocols. Rachel explained that while the damage Linda had inflicted could be reversed, it would take months of careful treatment and complete elimination of the toxins from my system. More importantly for my immediate plans, she helped me understand the exact dosages Linda had been using, and how I could safely administer the same compounds back to her. "Sarah, I have to ask," Rachel said as we prepared to leave the pharmacy. "Are you absolutely certain you want to go through with this? What you're planning is dangerous, not just legally, but personally. If Linda realizes what you're doing, she could escalate to something much more direct." I considered her question carefully. The rational part of my mind knew that I should simply take our evidence to the police and let the legal system handle Linda Thompson. But I also knew that Linda was smart, careful, and had spent decades building a reputation that would make any accusations seem absurd. She was a pillar of the Riverside community, a woman whose word carried weight with doctors, law enforcement, and anyone else who might investigate my claims. "She's been playing the long game for 3 years," I told Rach. "She's turned my own husband against me, convinced my doctor that I'm just stressed, and made the entire Thompson family believe that she's this perfect, caring mother figure. If I go to the police now, it's my word against hers, and we both know who they'll believe." Rachel sighed, understanding the impossible position I was in. "So you want to gather more evidence by reversing the situation." I want her to experience exactly what she's been putting me through. I want her to understand the fear, the confusion, the helplessness of being poisoned by someone you trust, and I want her to confess, on record, to what she's been doing to me. The beauty of my plan was its simplicity. Linda had established a pattern of preparing special foods just for me, but she also had specific dietary preferences and health concerns that I could exploit. She was diabetic, carefully managing her blood sugar through diet and medication. She had high blood pressure, controlled through prescription drugs and salt restrictions. Most importantly, she trusted me just enough to accept food that I prepared, especially if it appeared to be a gesture of gratitude or family bond. Over the next few weeks, I began implementing my strategy with the same careful precision that Linda had used against me. I started small, offering to bring desserts to family gatherings, volunteering to help with meal preparation, and generally inserting myself more actively into the Thompson family food traditions. Linda seemed pleased by what she interpreted as my growing integration into her domain. "Sarah's really coming into her own as a Thompson woman," she told Mike during one Sunday dinner, her voice warm with approval. "She's finally learning to appreciate good home cooking and family traditions. If only she knew what I was really learning." My first test came during a casual Tuesday evening, when Mike and I stopped by his parents' house to drop off some tax documents. Linda immediately invited us to stay for dinner, insisting that she had more than enough pot roast to share. While she busied herself setting extra places at the table, I offered to prepare a salad to accompany the meal. "What a thoughtful daughter-in-law I have," Linda beamed, gesturing toward her well-stocked kitchen. "Help yourself to anything you need. You know where everything is by now." I did indeed know where everything was, including the small container of toxic powder that Linda kept hidden behind the flour canister. But more importantly, I knew about Linda's evening medication routine, and exactly which herbs and supplements would interact dangerously with her prescription. Rachel had helped me procure compounds that would cause mild but noticeable symptoms when combined with Linda's diabetes and blood pressure medication. As I prepared the salad, I carefully separated Linda's portion, adding what appeared to be extra seasoning, but was actually a precisely measured dose of compounds that would cause digestive upset and mild disorientation. Nothing dangerous, nothing that would cause permanent harm, but enough to give her a taste of the helplessness I had been experiencing for 3 years. Dinner proceeded normally, with Bob discussing his plans for planting tomatoes in the spring garden, and Mike updating his parents on office politics at the accounting firm. Linda ate heartily, complimenting my salad, and making plans for the upcoming Mother's Day celebration. I watched her carefully, noting when she took bites and how much she consumed. About an hour after we finished eating, Linda began showing signs of discomfort. She excused herself from the living room where we had been watching television, returning a few minutes later looking slightly pale. "I think something I ate isn't agreeing with me," she said, pressing a hand to her stomach. "Maybe I'm coming down with something." Mike immediately became concerned, jumping up to feel her forehead and asking if she needed anything. I watched the scene with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness, seeing how quickly Linda's family rallied around her at the first sign of illness. If only they had shown the same concern when I had been suffering. "Maybe you should lie down, Mom," Mike suggested, his voice full of worry. "Sarah and I can clean up the kitchen before we leave." "Oh, that's not necessary," Linda protested weakly, though she made no move to get up from her chair. "I'm sure it's just a little indigestion. These things happen at my age." But as the evening progressed, her symptoms worsened. She became dizzy when standing, complained of nausea, and seemed confused about simple details like what day of the week it was. By the time Mike and I left, Linda was leaning heavily on Bob's arm, looking genuinely frightened by her sudden illness. "I hope Mom's okay," Mike said as we drove home, his brow furrowed with concern. "She seemed fine when we got there, but she went downhill so quickly." "These stomach bugs can come on fast," I replied, echoing the same dismissive phrases Linda had used whenever I became ill after eating her food. "I'm sure she'll feel better tomorrow," but Linda didn't feel better the next day, or the day after that. When I called to check on her, Bob reported that she had been to see Dr. Williams twice, and was undergoing tests to determine what was causing her symptoms. The irony was delicious. Linda was experiencing exactly what I had gone through, including the frustration of dealing with medical professionals who couldn't find anything definitively wrong. "The doctor thinks it might be a new medication interaction," Bob explained during our phone conversation. "You know how many pills Linda takes for her various conditions. Sometimes these things just start conflicting with each other for no apparent reason." I made appropriate sympathetic noises while mentally noting how perfectly my plan was working. The compounds I had used were specifically chosen to mimic medication side effects, making it virtually impossible for anyone to suspect deliberate poisoning. Linda was getting a masterclass in her own methods. Over the following weeks, I continued my campaign with increasing confidence. I brought Linda homemade soup when she was feeling unwell, baked cookies for family gatherings that included special ingredients just for her, and even prepared an elaborate casserole for Mother's Day that left Linda bedridden for 2 days afterward. Each time, I maintained the perfect facade of a concerned daughter-in-law, offering comfort and support while secretly documenting Linda's symptoms and reactions. I was building a detailed record of her decline, just as I had documented my own suffering over the previous 3 years. The most satisfying moment came when Linda called me directly, her voice weak and confused, asking if I had any ideas about what might be causing her ongoing health problems. "I don't understand what's happening to me, Sarah," she whispered into the phone, sounding genuinely frightened. "The doctors can't find anything wrong, but I feel terrible all the time. I'm dizzy, nauseous, and I can barely think clearly anymore. It's like my body is betraying me." "That sounds awful, Linda," I replied, injecting just the right amount of sympathy into my voice. "Have you considered that it might be something you're eating? Sometimes food sensitivities can develop later in life, especially when we're dealing with stress or other health issues." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and I could practically hear the wheels turning in Linda's head. Was she beginning to suspect that someone might be deliberately causing her symptom, or was she simply grasping at straws, trying to find any explanation for her mysterious illness? "Do you really think it could be food-related?" she asked, finally, her voice carrying a note of hope. "I've been eating the same things for years, but maybe something has changed." "It's possible," I said carefully. "Maybe you should keep a food diary, track what you eat and how you feel afterward. Sometimes patterns emerge that aren't obvious at first." The suggestion was beautifully cruel, encouraging Linda to engage in the same desperate detective work that I had been forced to undertake during the early days of my own poisoning. I wanted her to experience the frustration of searching for answers that seemed to remain just out of reach, the paranoia that comes with suspecting that something sinister is happening, but being unable to prove it. As spring turned to summer, Linda's condition continued to deteriorate. She lost weight, developed a grayish pallor that reminded me painfully of my own appearance during the worst days of my illness, and began avoiding social gatherings because she felt too unwell to participate. The woman who had once commanded respect throughout Riverside was becoming a shadow of her former self. Mike was beside himself with worry, spending hours researching Linda's symptoms online and making appointments with specialists in Cleveland and Columbus. He couldn't understand how his vibrant, healthy mother had suddenly become so frail and sick. The rest of the Thompson family was equally concerned, organizing shifts to check on Linda and Bob, bringing meals when Linda was too weak to cook, and offering emotional support during what everyone assumed was a mysterious medical crisis. I played my role perfectly, showing up with flowers and magazines, offering to run errands or help with household tasks, and generally presenting myself as the devoted daughter-in-law who was deeply concerned about her mother-in-law's welfare. But privately, I was keeping detailed records of Linda's decline, documenting each symptom, and noting how they corresponded to the meals I had prepared for her. The parallels to my own experience were striking and deliberate. Linda was going through exactly what I had endured, with one crucial difference. She knew what it felt like to be healthy, so the contrast was even more jarring. She could remember a time when her mind was sharp and her body was strong, making her current condition all the more terrifying. By July, Linda had become genuinely desperate. She had seen multiple doctors, undergone countless tests, and tried various treatments, all without success. Her symptoms continued to worsen, and she was beginning to show signs of the psychological strain that comes with chronic, unexplained illness. She became paranoid about food contamination, insisted on preparing all her own meals despite her weakness, and started carrying a notebook where she recorded everything she ate along with detailed descriptions of how she felt afterward. It was during this period that Linda made a discovery that would change everything. While organizing her kitchen cabinets in a fit of obsessive cleaning, she found the small container of toxic powder that she had been using to poison me. But in her confused, weakened state, she couldn't immediately remember what it was or why she had hidden it behind the flour canister. I wasn't there when she found it, but Bob told Mike about the incident during one of their worried phone conversations, and Mike relayed the story to me that evening as we prepared dinner in our own kitchen. "Mom found some kind of unmarked container in her spice cabinet," he said, his voice troubled. She couldn't remember what it was or how long it had been there. She's convinced that it might be some kind of contaminated seasoning that's been making her sick. My heart raced as I absorbed this information. Linda had found the smoking gun, the evidence of her own crimes, but in her poisoned, confused state, she didn't recognize it for what it was. The irony was almost too perfect to be real. Did she throw it away? I asked, trying to keep my voice casual while internally calculating how this development might affect my plans. That's the weird part, Mike replied, frowning as he chopped vegetables for our salad. She gave it to Dr. Williams to have it tested. She's convinced that it's the source of her problems, even though she can't remember ever buying anything like it. This was a potentially dangerous development. If Dr. Williams had the container analyzed and discovered what it actually contained, it could lead to questions that I wasn't prepared to answer. But it could also provide the perfect opportunity to expose Linda's crimes, assuming I could find a way to connect the poison seasoning to her deliberate campaign against me. I realized that the time for subtle manipulation was coming to an end. Linda's discovery of the container meant that the truth was getting dangerously close to the surface, and I needed to control how that revelation unfolded. It was time to move to the next phase of my plan, the part where Linda would be forced to confront the reality of what she had done and face the consequences of her actions. But first I needed to ensure that I had enough evidence to prove my case beyond any doubt. The container of poison was just one piece of the puzzle. I needed testimony, documentation, and preferably a confession that would make Linda's guilt undeniable. And I had an idea for exactly how to get it. The annual Thompson family reunion was scheduled for the first weekend in August, a tradition that brought together 3 generations of the extended family for a weekend of food, games, and storytelling. Linda had been the primary organizer of these gatherings for decades, taking pride in hosting elaborate meals and coordinating activities that would create lasting memories for everyone involved. This year, however, Linda was in no condition to manage such an undertaking. Her illness had progressed to the point where she could barely manage basic daily activities, let alone orchestrate a complex family event. The responsibility had fallen to Jenny and Carlos, with support from other family members who were eager to ensure that the tradition continued despite Linda's health problem. But I volunteered to take over the meal planning and preparation, presenting it as a way to honor Linda while giving her the rest she desperately needed. I know I can't replace Linda's cooking, I told the family during a planning meeting at Bob and Linda's house, but I'd like to try to carry on her traditions. Maybe she could supervise and give me guidance, so we don't lose all that wonderful family knowledge. The suggestion was met with enthusiasm from everyone except Linda herself, who looked genuinely distressed at the thought of relinquishing control of her domain, but she was too weak to object effectively, and the family pressure to accept help was overwhelming. "That's incredibly thoughtful of you, Sarah," Jenny said, tears gathering in her eyes. "Mom has worked so hard on these reunions for so many years. It would mean the world to her to know that the tradition will continue." Linda managed a weak smile, but I could see the calculation behind her eyes. She was trying to figure out how to maintain control over the situation while appearing grateful for my assistance. It was the same manipulative intelligence that had allowed her to poison me for 3 years without detection, but now it was hampered by the physical and mental effects of her own medicine. "Of course I'd love Sarah's help," Linda said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "and I'd be happy to share some of my special recipes and techniques. There are certain family secrets that have been passed down for generations." "I'll bet there are," I thought grimly, but I maintained my expression of eager gratitude. "That would be wonderful, Linda. I want everything to be perfect for the family." As the reunion approached, Linda and I spent several afternoons together in her kitchen, ostensibly so she could teach me her methods for preparing the traditional dishes that everyone expected. But I had an ulterior motive for these sessions. I wanted to observe Linda's behavior when she thought she was in control, and I wanted to create opportunities for her to reveal information about her poisoning techniques. The sessions were enlightening in ways I hadn't anticipated. Linda's illness had affected her cognitive function enough that she occasionally let slip details about her methods that she would normally have kept hid. During one afternoon when we were discussing seasoning blends, she mentioned having special ingredients that she used to customize dishes for individual family members. Everyone has different tastes and different needs, she explained, her voice taking on a lecturing tone that reminded me of her nursing background. The key is understanding how different compounds interact with each other and with individual body chemistry. It's really quite scientific when you approach it properly. That's fascinating, I replied, encouraging her to continue. I had no idea that cooking could be so technical. Do you use actual medical knowledge in your meal plan? Linda's eyes sharpened slightly, and for a moment I thought she might realize what I was fishing for, but then the moment passed and she continued with what sounded like a well-rehearsed explanation. Well, when you've spent as many years in healthcare as I have, you learn things about nutrition and drug interactions that most people never consider. For instance, certain herbs can enhance or interfere with medication. Some combinations of foods can cause digestive upset in sensitive individuals. It's all about understanding the science behind cooking. I filed away every word, noting how Linda seemed to be defending practices that went far beyond normal cooking consideration. She was essentially describing the methodology behind her poisoning campaign, though she was framing it as legitimate culinary expertise. As we worked together, I also began implementing the final phase of my own poisoning program. Since Linda was now completely focused on her own health problems, she was less suspicious of food that I prepared. I was able to administer increasingly potent doses of the compounds that were making her sick, accelerating her decline in preparation for the reunion weekend. By the time the family gathering arrived, Linda was in terrible condition. She had lost nearly 20 pounds, her hands shook constantly, and she seemed confused about basic details like family members' names and age. But she insisted on participating in the reunion preparations, driven by a desperate need to maintain her position as the family matriarch. Despite her obvious incapacity, the reunion weekend would provide the perfect stage for the final confrontation I had been planning. With the entire extended Thompson family present as witnesses, I would finally expose Linda's crimes and force her to confess to what she had been doing to me. But first, I needed to ensure that she was weak enough and confused enough that she couldn't effectively defend herself or manipulate the situation to her advantage. The pieces were all falling into place exactly as I had planned. Soon, Linda Thompson would discover what it felt like to be completely helpless, surrounded by people who claimed to love her but refused to believe that she was being deliberately harmed. She would experience the same isolation and desperation that I had endured for 3 years, with one crucial difference. Her suffering would be witnessed by everyone she cared about, and her crimes would be exposed for all to see. Justice, I had learned, was best served at exactly the right temperature. The first cars began arriving at the Thompson family reunion on Friday evening, filling the circular driveway of Bob and Linda's house with vehicles bearing license plates from 3 different states. I watched from the kitchen window as Mike's cousins unloaded coolers and overnight bags, their children racing across the carefully maintained lawn while adults called out greetings and exchanged hugs. The scene should have been heartwarming, a celebration of family bonds and shared history, but I felt like a predator watching prey gather for a feast. Linda sat at the kitchen table behind me, slumped in her chair with a cup of tea growing cold between her trembling hands. She had insisted on being present to greet each arriving family member, but the effort was clearly beyond her current capabilities. Her once sharp eyes were dull and unfocused, her usually pristine appearance disheveled despite Bob's attempts to help her dress appropriately for the occasion. The contrast between the vibrant hostess who had commanded these gatherings for decades and the frail woman before me was stark enough to generate genuine sympathy from anyone who didn't know what she had done to deserve her current condition. "Sarah, honey," Linda said, her voice barely audible above the sounds of arrival outside, "I think I need to lie down for a while before dinner. Could you handle greeting everyone? I just need a few minutes to gather my strength." The request represented a complete abdication of her traditional role as family matriarch, something that would have been unthinkable just a year earlier. Linda Thompson had never missed a reunion arrival, never delegated the responsibility of welcoming family members into her home, never shown weakness in front of the extended clan that looked to her for leadership and organization. Her current incapacity was a testament to how thoroughly my campaign had succeeded in breaking down her defenses. "Of course," I replied, injecting appropriate concern into my voice, while internally celebrating this victory. "You should rest. I'll make sure everyone knows you're not feeling well and that you'll join us when you're ready." As Linda shuffled toward the back staircase that led to the master bedroom, I stepped onto the front porch to begin playing the role of gracious hostess. Mike's cousin David was approaching with his wife and 2 teenage daughters, carrying a casserole dish that likely contained his famous cornbread stuffing. Behind them, Uncle Frank was attempting to corral his 3 young grandchildren, while his daughter Martha supervised the unloading of what appeared to be enough luggage for a month-long expedition. "Sarah," David called out, his face lighting up with genuine warmth. "How wonderful to see you. Where's Aunt Linda? I was hoping to get her cornbread recipe before I have to head back to Kentucky." The question provided the perfect opening for me to establish the narrative that would frame the entire weekend. "Linda's not feeling well," I explained, arranging my features into an expression of worried sympathy. "She's been battling some kind of mysterious illness for months now. The doctors can't seem to figure out what's wrong, but she's lost a lot of weight and has very little energy. She's determined to participate in the reunion, but I'm trying to convince her to take it easy." David's expression immediately shifted to concern, echoing the reaction I had been receiving from every Thompson family member as news of Linda's condition spread through their network. "That's terrible. She seemed fine at Christmas." "What kind of illness are we talking about?" "Nobody knows for sure," I replied, which was technically true even if misleading. "Her symptoms keep changing, and every test comes back normal. It's been very frustrating for everyone, especially Linda. You know how she hates not being in control of everything." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Jenny and Carlos, who had driven down from Cleveland with their twin boys and enough sports equipment to stock a small athletics. Jenny immediately noticed Linda's absence and hurried over to where David and I were standing. "Where's Mom?" she asked, her voice tight with the anxiety that had become her default emotional state since Linda's illness began. She was so excited about everyone arriving. "She's been planning this weekend for months." I repeated my explanation about Linda needing rest, watching as Jenny's face crumpled with disappointment and worry. The transformation of Mike's confident, capable sister into a frightened daughter desperate for her mother's recovery had been one of the more unexpected consequences of my campaign. I hadn't anticipated how deeply Linda's condition would affect the entire family dynamic, creating ripple effects of stress and concern that extended far beyond my intended target. "Maybe I should go check on her," Jenny said, already moving toward the front door. "I think she really needs to sleep," I intercepted gently. "Why don't we let her rest for now?" She insisted that she wants to join us for dinner, so hopefully a nap will give her enough energy to participate. Over the next hour, I greeted the remaining arrivals with practiced warmth, each time explaining Linda's absence and fielding concerned questions about her health. The repetition allowed me to refine my narrative, emphasizing the mysterious nature of her illness while subtly highlighting my own role as the devoted daughter-in-law who had stepped up to help during this difficult time. By 6 o'clock, 23 family members had assembled in the Thompson house, filling the living room with conversation and laughter that felt slightly forced given Linda's obvious absence from the festivities. Bob moved through the gathering like a lost soul, attempting to play host while clearly being overwhelmed by responsibilities that Linda had always handled with effortless grace. Mike and his male cousins had taken over bar duties, serving beer and wine to adults while trying to maintain the traditional reunion atmosphere despite the underlying tension. I excused myself from the social gathering to begin final preparations for dinner, a meal that would serve as the stage for the confrontation I had been planning for months. Everything had to be perfect. The food, the timing, the witnesses, and most importantly, Linda's condition. She needed to be present and alert enough to understand what was happening, but weak and confused enough that she couldn't effectively defend herself or manipulate the situation to her advantage. The kitchen had been transformed into a military-style operations center, with multiple dishes in various stages of preparation covering every available surface. I had spent weeks planning this menu, selecting items that would showcase my apparent mastery of Linda's traditional recipes, while providing opportunities for the final phase of my poisoning campaign. The centerpiece was Linda's famous glazed ham, a recipe that had been in the Thompson family for 4 generations and was considered sacred by reunion standards. What the family didn't know was that I had made 2 versions of several dishes, including the ham. One set would be served to the general population, prepared with normal ingredients and completely safe for consumption. The other set contained carefully measured doses of the compounds that had been destroying Linda's health, concentrated into what would likely be her final poisoned meal. As I worked, I could hear the sounds of family interaction drifting from the living room, children playing games, adults catching up on each other's lives, the gentle background noise of a close-knit clan enjoying their annual gathering. It struck me as ironic that my moment of triumph would unfold against such a wholesome backdrop, but perhaps that was fitting. Linda had spent years hiding her poisonous intentions behind a facade of maternal warmth and family devotion. It seemed appropriate that her exposure would occur in the same setting where she had cultivated her reputation as the perfect mother and grandmother. At 7:30 I sent Mike upstairs to wake Linda for dinner. I could hear muffled conversation through the ceiling as he attempted to rouse her and convince her to join the family gathering. When they finally appeared in the kitchen, Linda looked like a ghost of her former self. She had managed to put on a dress and apply makeup, but the effort had clearly exhausted her. She leaned heavily on Mike's arm, her face pale and drawn, her hands shaking as she attempted to smooth her hair. "There's our hostess," I said brightly, moving to kiss her cheek in a gesture that looked affectionate but allowed me to assess her condition up close. Her skin felt clammy and cold, and I could see the confusion in her eyes as she struggled to process her surroundings. "The family's all here and excited to see you," I continued, taking her other arm to help guide her toward the dining room. "Dinner's ready whenever you are. I tried to prepare everything exactly the way you taught me." Linda managed a weak smile, though I could see the effort it cost. "Thank you, Sarah. I don't know what we would have done without you this weekend. You've been such a blessing to this family." The irony of her gratitude was almost overwhelming, but I maintained my expression of humble pleasure as we made our way to the dining room, where the extended family had assembled around the long table that had been set with Linda's finest china and crystal. The scene looked like something from a magazine spread about perfect family gatherings, multiple generations sharing a meal, children sitting between their parents, the warm glow of candles reflecting off polished silver and gleaming glassware. Bob stood at the head of the table, clearly uncomfortable with his unaccustomed role as primary host, but attempting to maintain family tradition. "Before we begin," he said, his voice carrying across the conversations, "I'd like to say a few words about how grateful Linda and I are to have everyone here this weekend. These gatherings mean everything to us, and seeing all of you together reminds us of what's truly important in life." The sentiment was met with murmurs of agreement and affection, family members reaching across the table to squeeze hands or exchange meaningful looks. Linda managed to smile and nod, though I could see the tremendous effort it required for her to remain upright in her chair. She was exactly where I needed her to be, present enough to witness her exposure, but too weak to mount an effective defense. As we began passing dishes around the table, I made sure that Linda received portions from the specially prepared items that contained my final cocktail of compound. Her appetite had been nearly non-existent for weeks, but family pressure and her own determination to maintain appearances motivated her to take small bites of everything that was placed before her. The conversation flowed around topics that had become standard for Thompson family reunions: updates on children's achievements, discussions of travel and career changes, gentle gossip about family members who weren't present, and nostalgic stories about previous gatherings. Linda participated as much as her condition allowed, but I noticed that her responses were becoming increasingly confused as the meal progressed and the latest dose of poison began affecting her system. "Linda, this ham is incredible," declared Mike's cousin Patricia, a food blogger from Chicago who considered herself an expert on culinary matters. "The glaze has such a complex flavor profile.
"What's your secret ingredient?" The question was directed at Linda, but she seemed to struggle with comprehending what was being asked. She stared at Patricia with a blank expression for several seconds before turning to look at me with obvious confusion. "I believe Linda shared some special seasoning techniques with me," I said smoothly, covering for her inability to respond while establishing my role as the repository of her cooking knowledge. "She's taught me so much about how different ingredients can enhance flavors in unexpected ways." "Well, whatever you did, it's delicious," Patricia continued, taking another bite of ham. "You'll have to give me the recipe before I head back to Chicago." Throughout the meal, I continued to monitor Linda's condition, while maintaining the perfect facade of a concerned family member. She was clearly struggling, occasionally losing track of conversations, dropping her fork, and showing signs of the nausea that had become her constant companion. But she was also fighting to remain present and alert, driven by decades of habit and her desperate need to maintain her position as family matriarch. The breakthrough moment came during dessert service, when Linda's great-nephew Tommy, a precocious 8-year-old, asked an innocent question that would catalyze everything I had been working toward. "Grandma Linda," Tommy said, his voice cutting through the adult conversation with the clarity that only children possess, "why do you always make Aunt Sarah's food different from everyone else's? My mom says you put special stuff in her plate." The question hit the table like a physical blow, creating an immediate silence that felt heavy and dangerous. Every adult present turned to look at Linda, whose face had gone completely white. She opened her mouth as if to respond, but no words came out. Instead, she began to sway in her chair, her eyes rolling back as the combination of stress and poison overwhelmed her system. "Linda," Bob shouted, jumping up from his chair as his wife began to collapse. "Someone," but I was already moving, catching Linda before she could fall to the floor and gently lowering her to the carpet beside her chair. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. I was providing emergency care to the woman I had been systematically poisoning, drawing on the first aid training I had acquired specifically to handle this moment. "She's breathing but unconscious," I announced, checking her pulse and positioning her in the recovery position. "Her heart rate is rapid and irregular. We need to get her to the hospital immediately." The room erupted into controlled chaos as family members sprang into action. Mike was on the phone with emergency services. Jenny was gathering Linda's medications and medical information, and several of the men were clearing a path to the front door for the paramedics who would arrive within minutes. But as I knelt beside Linda's unconscious form, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Her purse had fallen open when she collapsed, and among the scattered contents was a small digital recording device that appeared to have been running throughout the entire dinner. The red light indicating active recording was clearly visible, suggesting that Linda had been documenting something about the evening's events. Had she suspected what I was doing? Had she been gathering evidence of her own? The possibility that Linda might have been playing a deeper game than I realized sent a chill through my entire body. If she had been recording our conversations, if she had somehow figured out that I was poisoning her, then my carefully orchestrated plan might be about to backfire in ways I couldn't control. The paramedics arrived within 8 minutes, followed closely by 2 police officers who began asking routine questions about Linda's condition and the circumstances surrounding her collapse. I provided information about her recent health problems and the medications she had been taking, painting a picture of a woman whose mysterious illness had finally reached a crisis point. "Has she been under any unusual stress lately?" asked Officer Martinez, a middle-aged Hispanic woman, whose matter-of-fact approach suggested extensive experience with medical emergencies.
Any changes in her routine or environment that might have triggered this episode? "She's been worried about her health for months," I replied truthfully. "The doctors haven't been able to diagnose her condition, and I think the uncertainty has been very difficult for her psychologically. Tonight was important to her, because she wanted to host the family reunion despite feeling unwell." Officer Martinez nodded, making notes in a small notebook while her partner spoke with Bob about Linda's medical history. The routine nature of their questions suggested that they viewed this as a straightforward medical emergency rather than a criminal matter, which was exactly what I had hoped for. As the paramedics prepared to transport Linda to Riverside General Hospital, I made a crucial decision about the recording device. While everyone else was focused on the medical emergency, I quietly retrieved it from among the scattered contents of her purse and slipped it into my own pocket. Whatever Linda had been planning to document, I needed to understand the extent of her knowledge before anyone else discovered what might be on that recording. The family caravan to the hospital stretched across 3 vehicles, with Bob riding in the ambulance alongside Linda while the rest of us followed behind. Mike drove our car in tense silence, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles were white. Jenny sat in the back seat quietly crying and occasionally whispering prayers that her mother would be okay. At the hospital, we were directed to a waiting area where Bob was already speaking with Dr. Williams about Linda's condition. The emergency room physician, Dr. Sarah Chen, emerged after nearly 2 hours to provide an update that would change everything. "Mrs. Thompson is stable but critical," Dr. Chen explained to the assembled family members. "Her blood work shows evidence of multiple toxic substances in her system, consistent with either accidental poisoning or deliberate administration of harmful compounds. We're treating her symptoms, but we need to understand how these substances got into her system." The announcement created a stunned silence among the family members, who struggled to process the implications of what they were hearing. Bob looked completely bewildered, repeatedly asking how such a thing could be possible. Mike seemed frozen, staring at the doctor as if she were speaking a foreign language. But Jenny's reaction was different. She turned to look directly at me, her eyes narrowed with suspicion that hadn't been there before. "Chen," she said carefully, "what kind of toxic substances are we talking about? Could they have been administered through food?" "It's possible," the doctor replied. "The compounds we've identified could certainly be absorbed through the digestive system. We'll need to analyze everything Thompson consumed over the past several hours to determine the source of contamination." I felt the walls beginning to close in around me as the family members exchanged meaningful glances. The innocent explanation of mysterious illness was rapidly giving way to something much more sinister, and I could see calculations taking place behind their eyes as they began to consider who had access to Linda's food and who might have reason to harm her. "Sarah prepared most of tonight's dinner," Jenny said quietly, her voice carrying an accusation that she wasn't quite ready to voice openly. "She's been helping Mom with cooking for several weeks now." The statement hung in the air like a physical presence, creating a tension that was almost unbearable. Every family member present understood the implication, but no one seemed willing to voice the accusation directly. I was being positioned as the primary suspect in Linda's poisoning, and I realized that my carefully planned revenge was about to spiral completely out of my control. But I still had one card left to play, one piece of evidence that could shift the focus away from me and onto Linda herself. Reaching into my pocket, I withdrew the recording device I had retrieved from her purse and held it up for everyone to see. "I found this in Linda's purse when she collapsed," I said, my voice steady despite the racing of my heart. "I think she might have been trying to document something about her illness. Maybe we should listen to what she recorded before we start making accusations about who might have poisoned her." The suggestion was met with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension, but Mike reached for the device with obvious eagerness. "If Mom was recording something, we need to know what it was. Maybe she figured out what was making her sick." As Mike pressed the play button, I held my breath and prepared for whatever Linda Thompson had planned as her final move in the deadly game we had been playing for months. The truth was about to emerge, but I was no longer certain whether it would exonerate me or destroy me completely. The recording device crackled to life in Mike's trembling hands, filling the hospital waiting room with the sound of Linda's voice from earlier that evening. But what emerged from the speaker wasn't what any of us expected to hear. Instead of confused ramblings from a sick woman or evidence of my poisoning campaign, Linda's voice was clear, calculated, and utterly damning. Day 1095 of what I call Project Sarah. Linda's recorded voice began with chilling precision. "The subject continues to show satisfactory response to the graduated dosing protocol I established 18 months ago. Tonight's reunion dinner will serve as the final test before moving to the terminal phase of the experiment." The blood drained from my face as I realized what I was hearing. Linda hadn't been recording evidence of my crimes. She had been documenting her own. The woman I thought I had been systematically poisoning had been playing a game far more sophisticated than anything I could have imagined. Mike's hand shook so violently that he nearly dropped the device. "That's impossible," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the mechanical hum of the hospital's ventilation system. "That can't be Mom's voice." But it was unmistakably Linda Thompson speaking, her tone carrying the professional detachment of someone documenting a clinical experiment rather than describing the systematic murder of her daughter-in-law. The recording continued with increasingly horrifying details about dosage calculations, symptom monitoring, and timeline adjustments that revealed the depth of her planning and the coldness of her execution. "The beauty of this approach," Linda's voice continued, "is that everyone expects a retired nurse to be concerned about health and nutrition. Sarah's gradual decline appears completely natural to outside observers, including her own husband. The compounds I've selected will cause organ failure within the next 6 to 8 weeks, presenting as a tragic but believable case of early-onset autoimmune disease." Jenny had gone completely white, pressing her hands against her mouth as if to prevent herself from screaming. Bob stood frozen beside Mike, his face a mask of disbelief and horror as he processed the fact that his wife of 35 years was calmly discussing plans to murder Sarah. The other family members who had followed us to the hospital began backing away from the group, as if Linda's recorded confessions were somehow contagious. "I need to document tonight's dosage particularly carefully," the recording continued, "because I'm introducing a new compound that should accelerate the timeline significantly. Sarah has become too suspicious lately, asking too many questions about her symptoms and keeping food diary. It's time to conclude this experiment before she becomes a genuine threat to my operational security." The clinical language Linda used to describe my murder was perhaps the most chilling aspect of her confession. She spoke about ending my life with the same detached professionalism she might have used to discuss adjusting a patient's medication schedule. There was no emotion, no rage, no hint of the personal animosity that might explain such extreme action. I was simply a problem to be solved, a variable in an equation that needed to be eliminated. But the recording wasn't finished. As we continued listening in stunned silence, Linda's voice took on a different quality, becoming more animated, as she described the psychological aspects of her campaign against me. "The subject's emotional deterioration has been even more satisfying than the physical symptoms," she continued with obvious pleasure. "Watching Sarah struggle to convince her husband that something was wrong, seeing her frustration when medical tests came back normal, observing her growing paranoia about food and family gatherings, these psychological effects have been an unexpected bonus to the primary objective." Mike made a sound that was somewhere between a sob and a moan, the device slipping from his nerveless fingers to clatter onto the hospital floor. The impact caused the recording to skip slightly, but Linda's voice remained audible as she continued her horrifying monologue. "I particularly enjoyed the period when Sarah started avoiding family dinners, thinking she could protect herself by limiting her exposure to my cooking. What she didn't realize was that I had already contaminated the spices and ingredients in her own kitchen, ensuring continued dosing regardless of where she chose to eat." The look of confusion on her face when symptoms persisted despite her precautions was absolutely delicious. The revelation that Linda had been in my house, tampering with my own food supplies, sent a wave of nausea through my system that had nothing to do with poisoning. She had violated the one space where I thought I was safe, turning my own kitchen into an extension of her laboratory. Every meal I had prepared for myself over the past months had been tainted by her manipulations. Of course, the real challenge has been maintaining my performance as the concerned mother-in-law, Linda's voice continued, now carrying a note of pride at her own deception. Expressing worry about Sarah's health, suggesting various remedies and treatments, even accompanying her to medical appointments, all while knowing exactly what was causing her symptoms and how to make them worse. It's required considerable acting ability, but I believe I've been quite convincing. Jenny finally found her voice, though it came out as a strangled whisper. How could she do this? How could Mom plan to murder Sarah and then comfort Mike when she got sick? What kind of monster have we been living with? The question hung in the air without answer because none of us could comprehend the level of calculation and deception that Linda's actions represent. She hadn't killed me in a moment of rage or passion. She had planned my death with the methodical precision of a scientist conducting research. Every family dinner, Every expression of concern, every offer of help had been part of an elaborate performance designed to mask her true intention. But the recording still wasn't finished, and what came next would shatter any remaining illusions about Linda Thompson's motivations. I suppose I should document why this experiment became necessary, Linda's voice continued, taking on a reflective tone. Sarah's marriage to Michael represented an unacceptable disruption to the family dynamic I had carefully cultivated over 3 decades. Michael's emotional dependence on me was perfect. He consulted me about every major decision, sought my approval for career moves, even asked my opinion about which friends he should maintain. Sarah's influence threatened to break that dependency and redirect his loyalty toward her. The explanation was delivered with the matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing weather patterns, but it revealed the twisted psychology that had driven Linda to attempt murder. She hadn't poisoned me because of any specific action I had taken or any personal conflict between us. She had decided to kill me simply because my relationship with Mike represented competition for his affection and attention. At first I hoped that subtle sabotage might be sufficient. The recording continued, creating friction between Sarah and other family members, encouraging Michael's doubts about the marriage, manufacturing situations that would highlight their incompatibility. But Sarah proved more resilient than I anticipated, and Michael's attachment to her continued to strengthen despite my intervention. I thought back to the early days of my marriage, remembering incidents that I had attributed to normal adjustment difficulties, but now recognized as Linda's deliberate manipulation. The family gathering where she had accidentally double-booked an event I was planning to attend, forcing me to choose between disappointing Mike's relatives or missing an important work function. The Christmas when she had given thoughtful, expensive gifts to every family member except me, claiming she hadn't been sure what I would like. The numerous occasions when she had shared embarrassing stories about Mike's childhood, just as he and I were getting close to other family members. The decision to move to direct intervention came after Sarah's first anniversary with Michael, Linda's voice explained. She was clearly establishing herself as a permanent fixture in his life, and I could see that my influence over him was beginning to wane. Poison offered the perfect solution because it would remove Sarah while positioning me as the supportive mother helping my son through a tragic loss. The cold calculation behind this reasoning was breathtaking in its sociopathic clarity. Linda had planned not just my death but also the aftermath, anticipating how she would console Mike and help him recover from the traumatic loss of his wife. She would have been there every step of the way, rebuilding the emotional dependency that my presence had threatened while appearing to be the loving mother helping her son heal. I selected compounds that would create symptoms consistent with autoimmune disorders or environmental sensitivities. The recording continued with clinical precision. The progression needed to appear natural while remaining undetectable through standard medical testing. My nursing background provided access to the necessary substances and knowledge of how to combine them for maximum effect with minimal risk of discovery. Mike had slumped into one of the waiting room chairs, his face buried in his hands as he processed the full scope of his mother's betrayal. It wasn't just that Linda had tried to murder his wife. She had violated every assumption he had ever made about her character, her values, and her love for him. The woman who had raised him, who had been the anchor of his emotional life for 34 years, was revealed to be a calculating killer who viewed his happiness as secondary to her own need for control. The timeline became compressed when Sarah began showing signs of increased suspicion. Linda's voice continued. Her attempts to document patterns in her illness and her growing reluctance to eat food I prepared suggested that she might eventually uncover the truth. I decided to accelerate the dosing schedule and introduce more potent compounds that would complete the process within weeks, rather than months. The recording was interrupted by the sound of voices and movement, suggesting that Linda had been interrupted during her documentation session. We could hear her speaking to someone else, her tone shifting to the warm, concerned register that I had come to associate with her public persona. "Sarah, honey, is everything all right?" we heard her say to someone off camera. "You look a little pale." My own voice responded, though it sounded distant and tired. "Just tired from all the preparation for tonight. I want everything to be perfect for the family." "Of course you do, sweetheart. You've worked so hard on this dinner."
Everyone's going to be so impressed with how you've learned to cook all our traditional recipes. The conversation continued for a few more exchanges, with Linda expressing maternal concern while simultaneously knowing that she had prepared what she intended to be my final meal. The contrast between her public performance and her private documentation was so stark that it felt like listening to two completely different people. When the recording resumed with Linda speaking privately, her tone shifted back to clinical detachment. The subject continues to display trust despite increasing physical symptoms, which confirms my assessment that the psychological manipulation has been as effective as the chemical intervention. Tonight's dosage should be sufficient to trigger the final phase of organ failure. Dr. Chen chose that moment to return to the waiting room, her expression grave as she took in the scene of a family in crisis. She had obviously overheard portions of the recording, and her medical training allowed her to immediately understand the implications of what Linda had been documenting. "I need to inform you that we've completed our analysis of Mrs. Thompson's blood work," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "The toxins in her system are consistent with deliberate poisoning, but the concentrations suggest that she may have been the one administering these substances, rather than receiving them. We found evidence of multiple compounds on her hands and under her fingernails." The doctor's findings confirmed what the recording had already revealed, but hearing it stated in medical terms somehow made Linda's crimes feel even more real and horrifying. She hadn't just been planning to murder me, she had been actively poisoning me for months, while maintaining the facade of a loving mother-in-law. "There's something else," Dr. Chen continued, glancing around at the assembled family members. "Miss Thompson regained consciousness briefly about an hour ago, and she made some statements that I'm required to report to law enforcement. She confessed to poisoning her daughter-in-law, and expressed regret that her experiment had been discovered before she could complete it." The admission that Linda had confessed even while hospitalized demonstrated just how thoroughly her plans had unraveled. The woman who had spent months calculating every detail of my murder had been undone by her own compulsive need to document her crimes and her inability to resist gloating about her success. Officer Martinez, who had been standing quietly near the entrance to the waiting room, stepped forward with her notebook ready. "Based on what we've heard here tonight and Mrs. Thompson's confession, we'll be placing her under arrest for attempted murder as soon as she's medically stable. We'll also need comprehensive statements from all family members about any suspicious incidents they may have witnessed." The legal proceedings that followed would eventually reveal the full scope of Linda's crime. Forensic analysis of her house uncovered a sophisticated laboratory in the basement, where she had been preparing poison cocktails and documenting their effects. Her computer contained detailed records of dosing schedules, symptom progression charts, and research into various toxins and their application. But perhaps most disturbing was the discovery of journals dating back to Mike's childhood, revealing that Linda's need to control the people she claimed to love had been a lifelong pattern. She had documented ways to manipulate Mike's friends, teachers, and romantic interests, always working to ensure that his primary emotional attachment remained focused on her. The journals revealed that I hadn't been her first victim. Mike's high school girlfriend had experienced mysterious illnesses that ended their relationship. His college roommate had suffered food poisoning so severe that he had to withdraw from school. A coworker he had been close to had developed sudden unexplained health problems that forced her to relocate for treatment. Linda Thompson had been systematically eliminating anyone who threatened her control over her son's life for nearly 2 decades, and I had simply been the latest target in a long campaign of manipulation and abuse. The irony of my own poisoning campaign against Linda wasn't lost on me as the full scope of her crimes became clear. I had been trying to give her a taste of her own medicine, but I had been using amateur methods against a woman who had been perfecting the art of poison for years. My attempts to make her sick had been largely ineffective because she had been monitoring her own blood chemistry and adjusting her medication regimen to counteract anything I might have given her. Linda had allowed me to think I was winning our secret war while continuing to escalate her own attacks against me. She had even used my increasing suspicion and paranoia as evidence that her psychological manipulation was working, documenting my behavior as part of her research into the effects of chronic poisoning on mental health. The realization that I had been completely outmaneuvered by someone far more experienced and ruthless was humbling, but it was also liberating. For months I had been consumed with thoughts of revenge and justice, allowing Linda's crimes to reshape my entire existence around the need to expose and punish her. Now that the truth was finally revealed, I could begin the process of healing from both the physical damage she had inflicted and the psychological trauma of being systematically betrayed by someone who claimed to care about me. Mike struggled far more with accepting the reality of his mother's crimes. The recordings and evidence were undeniable, but the emotional foundation of his entire life had been built on the assumption that Linda Thompson was a loving, protective mother who wanted only the best for her family. Learning that she was actually a manipulative killer who had viewed his happiness as secondary to her need for control required a complete reconstruction of his understanding of himself and his relationships. The recovery process was long and complicated for both of us. The physical effects of Linda's poisoning took months to fully resolve, requiring careful medical monitoring and gradual detoxification. The psychological effects took even longer to address, requiring extensive therapy to work through the trauma of being systematically betrayed by someone who had claimed to love me. But perhaps the most important part of the healing process was learning to trust again, not just other people but my own perceptions and instincts. Linda's manipulation had been so sophisticated that she had made me doubt my own experiences and question my own sanity. Recovering from that kind of psychological abuse required rebuilding confidence in my ability to accurately assess situations and people. Mike and I eventually moved away from Riverside, finding it impossible to maintain normal lives in a community where everyone knew the details of Linda's crime. We settled in a city where we could start fresh, building new relationships and creating new traditions that weren't tainted by memories of family gatherings where poison was served alongside love. Linda was sentenced to 25 years in prison for attempted murder, with additional charges related to her other victims over the year. The judge who sentenced her noted that her crimes were particularly heinous because she had used her medical knowledge and family relationships to exploit trust and cause maximum harm to people who had no reason to suspect her intention. She never showed remorse for her actions, maintaining throughout the trial that she had been protecting her family from outside influences that threatened their stability. Even in prison, she continued to insist that her love for Mike had motivated everything she had done, apparently unable to understand that true love doesn't involve murdering people who make your loved ones happy. The Thompson family never recovered from the scandal. Bob divorced Linda and moved to Florida, unable to reconcile the woman he had been married to with the monster who had been revealed in court. Jenny and Carlos relocated to Denver, wanting to put distance between themselves and the community where their family name had become synonymous with betrayal and murder. The annual family reunions ended permanently, as no one could imagine gathering to celebrate relationships that had been built on such fundamental deception. The traditions that had once bound the Thompson clan together became painful reminders of how thoroughly Linda had poisoned, not just individual people but the entire family dynamic. As for me, I learned that survival sometimes requires becoming someone you never thought you could be. I had entered into a war I didn't understand against an enemy whose capabilities I had vastly underestimated, but I had also discovered reserves of strength and determination that I hadn't known I possessed. The woman who sits here today telling you this story is not the same person who first walked into Linda Thompson's kitchen as a naive newlywed. I am harder now, more suspicious, less willing to accept surface appearances or trust in the goodness of others. Some might call that damage, but I prefer to think of it as education. I learned that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious signs and dramatic gestures. Sometimes it wears the face of a loving mother, speaks in gentle tones and serves poison with a smile. The most dangerous predators are often those who have learned to camouflage themselves as protectors, using our own love and trust as weapons against us. But I also learned that truth has a way of emerging, even when it's buried under years of careful deception and manipulation. Linda Thompson spent decades perfecting her ability to control and harm others while maintaining a facade of respectability and love. But in the end, her own compulsive need to document her crimes became the evidence that destroyed her. Justice, as it turned out, was indeed best served at exactly the right temperature. It just wasn't the temperature I had originally planned to serve it at. The courtroom was packed on the day of Linda Thompson's sentencing, filled with faces I recognized from 3 years of forced family gatherings and community events where she had played the role of beloved matriarch. Reporters occupied the front rows, their cameras capturing every moment of what had become the most sensational criminal case in Riverside's history. The woman who had once been respected throughout the county as a dedicated nurse and loving mother, now sat at the defendant's table in an orange jumpsuit, her gray hair unkempt and her hands shackled to a chain around her waist. Judge Patricia Henley, a stern woman in her 60s who had presided over criminal cases for nearly 20 years, reviewed the evidence one final time before delivering her verdict. The prosecution had presented an overwhelming case against Linda, including the recording device, forensic evidence from her basement laboratory, medical records documenting my systematic poisoning, and testimony from multiple victims spanning 2 decades of her crimes. Miss Thompson, Judge Henley began, her voice carrying the weight of authority and moral judgment. In my 30 years of legal practice, I have rarely encountered a case that demonstrates such calculated malice and abuse of trust. You used your medical knowledge and family relationships to systematically torture and attempt to murder innocent people, all while maintaining a facade of care and concern that makes your crimes particularly heinous. Linda showed no emotion as the judge spoke, sitting rigid in her chair with the same controlled expression she had worn throughout the trial. Her defense attorney had attempted to argue for reduced charges based on mental illness, but multiple psychiatric evaluations had concluded that Linda was fully competent and aware of her actions. She wasn't insane, she was simply evil. The evidence presented in this case reveals a pattern of manipulation and abuse that spans decades. Judge Henley continued, you have systematically eliminated anyone who threatened your psychological control over your son, using poison as your weapon of choice because your medical background allowed you to inflict maximum suffering while avoiding detection. The judge's words carried special significance for me as I sat in the gallery beside Mike, who had aged visibly during the months since his mother's arrest.
The man I had married had been forced to confront the reality that his entire childhood and adult relationship with Linda had been built on manipulation and control. Every memory he treasured, every moment of maternal comfort he had experienced, was now tainted by the knowledge of what Linda was truly capable of. Sarah Thompson, Judge Henley said, turning to address me directly, represents only the most recent victim in a long campaign of terror that you conducted against anyone who dared to form meaningful relationships with your son. Your systematic poisoning of this young woman over 3 years demonstrates a level of premeditation and cruelty that demands the harshest possible punishment. The reference to other victims brought a wave of sorrow that I had been struggling with since the investigation had revealed the full scope of Linda's crimes. Mike's high school girlfriend, Jessica Morris, had traveled from California to testify about the mysterious illness that had ended her relationship with him during their senior year. David Chen, Mike's college roommate, had described the food poisoning that had nearly killed him and forced him to withdraw from school, ending what had been a close friendship with Mike. Most heartbreaking was the testimony of Amanda Foster, a coworker from Mike's first job after college, who had developed severe neurological symptoms after becoming close friends with him. Amanda had spent years seeking medical treatment for conditions that had mysteriously appeared and then gradually resolved after she moved to a different city for a new job. She had never connected her illness to Linda until the investigation brought them together, revealing the true source of her suffering. Each victim's story followed the same pattern. They had formed meaningful relationships with Mike. Linda had perceived them as threats to her control, and they had subsequently experienced mysterious health problems that drove them away from him. Linda had been systematically isolating her son for decades, ensuring that she remained the primary emotional figure in his life by eliminating anyone who might compete for his affection. Furthermore, Judge Henley continued, the sophistication of your methods demonstrates that these were not crimes of passion or momentary lapses in judgment. You maintained detailed records of your poisoning activities, treated human suffering as scientific data, and showed no remorse for the pain you inflicted on innocent people. The prosecution had introduced Linda's journals and computer files as evidence, revealing the clinical detachment with which she had documented her crime. She had recorded dosage amounts, tracked symptom progression, and noted the effectiveness of different compounds with the precision of a researcher conducting legitimate medical study. The journals contained detailed psychological profiles of her victims, analyzing their relationships with Mike and strategizing about the most effective ways to eliminate them. Perhaps most disturbing were Linda's notes about her long-term plans for Mike's life. She had envisioned maintaining her control over him indefinitely, preventing him from forming lasting romantic relationships or close friendships that might challenge her authority. In her twisted worldview, Mike existed primarily to provide her with emotional satisfaction and social status, and anyone who threatened that arrangement needed to be eliminated. The impact of your crimes extends far beyond the physical harm you inflicted, Judge Henley observed. You have destroyed families, betrayed the trust of an entire community, and violated the fundamental principles of medical ethics that should have guided your professional conduct. The community impact of Linda's crimes had indeed been devastating. Riverside General Hospital had launched a comprehensive review of their former employees' activities, questioning whether she had ever harmed patients during her 30-year career. While no evidence of medical misconduct was discovered, several families came forward with questions about unexpected complications or deaths that had occurred while Linda was involved in patient care. The revelation that a respected healthcare professional had been using her knowledge to harm rather than heal had shaken the faith of many residents in their local medical community. Williams, who had been Linda's colleague for years, testified that she felt personally violated by the discovery that someone she had trusted and worked alongside was capable of such systematic evil. Your betrayal of your profession is particularly egregious, the judge continued, because society grants medical professionals extraordinary trust and access to vulnerable people. You have violated that sacred responsibility in the most fundamental way possible. Linda's former colleagues at the hospital had been devastated by the revelation of her crimes. Nurses who had looked up to her as a mentor discovered that the woman they had admired for her competence and compassion was actually a calculating killer. Doctors who had relied on her clinical judgment learned that she had been using her medical knowledge to plan murders rather than save lives. The ripple effects of Linda's crimes had touched virtually every aspect of Riverside's healthcare community. Protocols were revised to prevent similar abuses, background checks were expanded, and additional oversight measures were implemented to ensure that no other healthcare professional could use their position to harm patients or community members. Your son Michael, Judge Henley said, her voice softening slightly, has perhaps suffered the greatest harm of all your victims. You have not only endangered his wife's life, but destroyed his ability to trust in the most fundamental relationships of his existence. This observation hit particularly close to home for me as I watched Mike struggle with the psychological aftermath of his mother's crime. He had been forced to question every memory of maternal love and support, wondering whether Linda's care had been genuine or simply another form of manipulation designed to maintain her control over him. The process of recovering from such profound betrayal had required extensive therapy for both of us. Mike had needed to work through decades of conditioning that had taught him to prioritize Linda's approval above his own judgment. He had to learn to recognize the subtle ways she had manipulated his emotions and decisions, understanding how she had systematically prevented him from developing independent relationships and perspective. Our marriage had required rebuilding from the ground up, establishing new patterns of communication and trust that weren't influenced by Linda's interference. We had to learn to function as a couple without the constant pressure of her manipulation and control, discovering who we actually were when we weren't being actively sabotaged by someone who claimed to love us. The court finds, Judge Henley announced, that Linda Thompson is guilty of attempted murder in the first degree, multiple counts of aggravated assault, conspiracy to commit murder, and abuse of a vulnerable adult. Given the systematic nature of these crimes and the defendant's complete lack of remorse, this court sentences Linda Thompson to 25 years in state prison without the possibility of parole. The sentence was met with a mixture of relief and satisfaction from the packed courtroom. Several of Linda's victims had attended the hearing, wanting to see justice finally served for the years of suffering she had inflicted on them. Family members who had trusted her and been betrayed watched as the woman they had once loved was led away in shackles to begin what would likely be the remainder of her life in prison. Linda showed no emotion as the sentence was pronounced, maintaining the same cold composure she had displayed throughout the trial. She didn't acknowledge the victims who had testified against her, didn't express remorse for the harm she had caused, and didn't seem to grasp the magnitude of the destruction she had created in so many lives. As the proceedings concluded and Linda was escorted from the courtroom, I felt a complex mixture of emotions that I had been struggling to process since her arrest. There was satisfaction in seeing justice served, relief that she could never harm anyone else, and vindication that my suspicions about her had ultimately been proven correct. But there was also sadness for the family that had been destroyed, grief for the relationships that could never be repaired, and a profound sense of loss for the innocence that Linda's crimes had stolen from all of us. The months following Linda's sentencing marked the beginning of a new chapter in my life, one defined by healing rather than survival. The physical effects of her poisoning gradually resolved with proper medical treatment, though some damage would remain permanent. My digestive system had been compromised by years of toxic exposure, requiring ongoing dietary restrictions and medication to manage chronic inflammation. But the psychological healing proved more challenging than the physical recovery. Linda's manipulation had been so sophisticated that it had affected my ability to trust my own perceptions and judgment. I had to relearn how to distinguish between genuine kindness and calculated manipulation, how to accept help without suspecting ulterior motives, and how to form relationships without constantly analyzing them for signs of deception. Therapy became an essential part of my recovery process, helping me understand how Linda's abuse had affected my mental health and providing tools for rebuilding my sense of self-worth and personal agency. I learned that victims of systematic manipulation often struggle with self-doubt and hypervigilance, constantly questioning their own perceptions because they had been gaslighted so effectively by their abuser. The therapist helped me understand that Linda's crimes weren't a reflection of any failure or weakness on my part. I had been targeted not because of anything I had done wrong, but simply because I represented a threat to Linda's psychological control over me. Her decision to poison me had been based on her own pathological need for dominance, not on any legitimate grievance or rational motivation. Mike's recovery process was even more complex than mine because his relationship with Linda extended back to his earliest childhood memory. He had to work through decades of conditioning and manipulation, learning to identify the subtle ways Linda had controlled his thoughts and decisions throughout his life. The realization that his mother had been systematically eliminating anyone who might have become important to him was particularly devastating. We discovered that Linda's manipulation had extended far beyond her obvious victim. She had influenced Mike's career choices, steering him away from opportunities that might have taken him too far from her sphere of influence. She had subtly discouraged friendships and romantic relationships that she perceived as threats, using emotional manipulation to make Mike doubt his own judgment about people he cared about. The process of untangling decades of such manipulation required Mike to essentially reconstruct his understanding of himself and his relationships. He had to learn to make decisions based on his own values and preferences, rather than unconsciously seeking Linda's approval. He had to develop new patterns of thinking that weren't influenced by her psychological conditioning. Our marriage became stronger through this process, but it also became something entirely different from what it had been before Linda's crimes were exposed. We had to learn to relate to each other as independent adults rather than as people whose relationship was mediated through her manipulation and control. We discovered aspects of each other's personalities that had been suppressed or hidden during the years when Linda was actively working to undermine our connection. Moving away from Riverside was essential for our healing process. The community held too many painful memories and associations with Linda's crimes for us to build a healthy life there. We relocated to Portland, Oregon, where I had grown up, finding comfort in familiar surroundings and the support of friends who had known me before I became entangled in the Thompson family dynamic. The fresh start allowed us to create new traditions and relationships that weren't tainted by Linda's influence. We could host dinner parties without wondering whether our guests were safe, prepare meals without analyzing every ingredient for potential contamination, and build friendships without constantly assessing people's motivations for wanting to spend time with us. But perhaps most importantly, the distance from Riverside allowed us to begin processing the full scope of what we had endured without the constant reminder of the community where Linda's crimes had unfolded. We could focus on healing rather than reliving the trauma, building rather than just surviving. The legal aftermath of Linda's case continued for years after her sentencing. Civil lawsuits were filed by multiple victims, seeking compensation for medical expenses and psychological damage. The hospital where Linda had worked faced scrutiny about their hiring and oversight practices, leading to policy changes designed to prevent similar situations in the future. Linda's assets were eventually liquidated to provide restitution to her victims, though no amount of money could truly compensate for the years of suffering she had inflicted. The house on Oak Avenue where so many family gatherings had taken place was sold, with the proceeds distributed among those she had harmed. Bob used his portion to relocate to Florida, seeking a fresh start far from the scene of his wife's crime. The broader Thompson family gradually dispersed, unable to maintain relationships that had been built around Linda's central role as matriarch. Jenny and Carlos moved to Denver where they could raise their children away from the shadow of their family's scandal. Other relatives relocated or simply stopped maintaining contact, finding it too painful to be reminded of how thoroughly they had been deceived by someone they had trusted and loved. The annual reunions that had been such an important tradition for decades ended permanently, as no one could imagine gathering to celebrate relationships that had been revealed to be fundamentally dishonest. The family bonds that Linda had claimed to be protecting through her crimes were ultimately destroyed by her actions, leaving behind scattered individuals trying to rebuild their lives independently. My own relationship with the surviving Thompson family members evolved slowly and carefully. Jenny and I maintained occasional contact, bonding over our shared experience of being deceived by Linda and our mutual concern for Mike's well-being. But the easy familiarity of our earlier relationship could never be restored, tainted as it was by the knowledge of what had been happening beneath the surface of those family gatherings. Bob struggled perhaps more than anyone else with accepting the reality of Linda's crime. He had been married to her for 35 years, sharing a home and a life with someone who was systematically murdering people while maintaining the facade of a loving wife and mother. The revelation that he had been completely unaware of her true nature challenged his understanding of himself and his judgment about people. In rare phone conversations, Bob would express his continued disbelief that the woman he had slept beside for decades could have been capable of such calculated evil. He had known Linda's professional competence and community reputation, but he had also seen her private moments of vulnerability and tenderness. Reconciling those memories with the evidence of her crimes required a complete reconstruction of his understanding of their shared life. The community of Riverside itself struggled to process the implications of Linda's crimes. She had been involved in numerous civic organizations, volunteer activities and social groups throughout her retirement. People who had worked alongside her on charity fundraisers and community projects were forced to question whether they had ever truly known her, whether her apparent compassion and civic engagement had been genuine or simply another form of manipulation. The local newspaper published a series of investigative articles examining Linda's community involvement and looking for signs that might have indicated her true nature, but the reporters found only evidence of the carefully constructed public persona she had maintained for decades: testimonials from grateful patients, recognition for her volunteer work, and praise from colleagues who had never suspected the darkness behind her professional competence. This inability to identify warning signs or red flags became a source of ongoing anxiety for many Riverside residents. If someone as respected and trusted as Linda Thompson could be capable of systematic murder, how could anyone feel confident in their ability to recognize dangerous people in their own lives? The case undermined the basic social trust that allows communities to function, creating a lasting legacy of suspicion and wariness. As years passed, the acute trauma of Linda's crimes gradually evolved into a more manageable form of chronic awareness. Mike and I learned to live with the knowledge of what had happened without allowing it to completely define our existence. We developed new routines and relationships that weren't overshadowed by memories of her manipulation and abuse. We also became advocates for other victims of systematic abuse, particularly those who had been harmed by people in positions of trust and authority. My experience with Linda's sophisticated manipulation techniques provided insights that could help others recognize similar patterns of behavior before they escalated to violence. Speaking publicly about the case was initially difficult, requiring me to relive traumatic memories and expose intimate details of my suffering to strangers, but sharing the story also proved therapeutic,
helping me process my experiences while potentially protecting others from similar harm. The more people understood about how intelligent, educated predators operated, the better equipped they would be to protect themselves and their loved ones. The case attracted attention from researchers studying family violence and psychological abuse, leading to academic papers and conference presentations that analyzed Linda's methods and motivation. These scholarly examinations helped establish new frameworks for understanding how trusted family members could systematically harm their relatives while maintaining facades of love and care. Mental health professionals began incorporating lessons from Linda's case into their training programs, teaching therapists and counselors to recognize signs of systematic manipulation and abuse within family systems. The sophisticated nature of her psychological manipulation techniques provided valuable insights into how predators could exploit family relationships to avoid detection while inflicting maximum harm. Law enforcement agencies also studied the case to improve their ability to investigate similar crimes. Linda's use of medical knowledge to commit nearly undetectable poisoning highlighted gaps in standard investigative procedures and the need for specialized training in cases involving healthcare professionals who abuse their expertise. The ripple effects of Linda's crimes thus extended far beyond her immediate victims, influencing professional practices and academic understanding in ways that might ultimately help protect future potential victims. While nothing could undo the harm she had inflicted, her case contributed to systemic changes that could prevent similar tragedies. For Mike and me personally, the healing process continues even now, years after Linda's conviction. We have built a new life together based on honesty and mutual support rather than the elaborate deceptions that characterized our early marriage. We have learned to recognize and address problems directly rather than allowing them to fester beneath the surface, and we have developed communication patterns that don't rely on external mediation or approval. Our relationship has become something entirely different from what it was during the years when Linda was manipulating our lives, but it has also become stronger and more authentic. We know that we chose each other not because we were manipulated into doing so, but because we genuinely value the connection we have built despite the obstacles that were placed in our path. The woman who survived Linda Thompson's systematic poisoning campaign is not the same person who first walked into that kitchen as a trusting newlywed. I am more cautious now, more analytical about people's motivations, and less willing to accept surface appearances without deeper investigation. Some might consider these changes damage, but I prefer to think of them as hard-earned wisdom. I learned that evil can wear the mask of love, that betrayal can come from those closest to us, and that survival sometimes requires becoming someone you never thought you could be. But I also learned that truth has power, that justice is possible even when it seems impossible, and that healing can occur even after the most profound violations of trust. The story of Linda Thompson's crimes serves as a reminder that we must remain vigilant about the people we allow into our lives, particularly those who seek positions of trust and authority. But it also demonstrates that even the most sophisticated manipulation can ultimately be exposed, and that victims of systematic abuse can find the strength to seek justice and rebuild their lives. Linda Thompson is now 73 years old, serving her sentence in a maximum security prison where she will likely remain for the rest of her life. According to prison officials, she continues to maintain her innocence and shows no remorse for her crime. She has never acknowledged the harm she inflicted on her victims, or expressed any understanding of why her actions were wrong, but her victims have moved on, building new lives free from her manipulation and control. We have learned to trust again, to love again, and to believe in the possibility of genuine human connection despite the profound betrayal we experienced, and in the end, perhaps that is the greatest victory of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.